Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer. And with me once again is my good friend, Deb Romero, certified Alexander Technique instructor and master of all things anatomical. I should throw that in. Because you used to teach anatomy, didn't you, Deb?
Yes, I think that's when you learn it the best, is when you have to teach it.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, and today we're going to tackle another research paper that really actually having to digest this paper and talk about it, you do learn a lot.
Yes.
Just to sit and discuss it with you in detail, I have already read it 3 times and there's a lot to digest.
Yes.
How
it's
about
great,
you?
though. I've read it 4 or 5 times and highlighted and made notes. And
so today's topic, which I failed to mention, is a discussion about a research paper titled Spinal Biomechanics and Functional Anatomy. The author is Jean-Marie Denoix. He's a veterinarian and PhD. And this particular paper, which was published in 1999, it's sort of a, what do you want to say, life altering or perspective altering publication. So it was published in April of 1999, and PubMed is listed that it has 92 citations and 8 highly influential citations. And that's just PubMed. I'm sure this paper has been cited many times. So Jean-Marie Denoix decided basically up until that point, a lot of studies on horses had been what they call in vivo with live subjects, right? And so he wanted to really look at the mechanical functions of the spine itself. How do these vertebrae move? What's going on between the bones? What is the range of motion? What's the space? What happens when you laterally bend? What happens during dorsiventral flexion? All of that. He wanted to really look closely at the mechanical functions of the horse's spine, or a whole axial skeleton, really.
Yeah.
Which is the skull, the spine, the rib cage, and the pelvis. So Deb and I decided to tackle this paper. It may take several podcasts because there's a lot to digest. And this is a really important paper for, I have 60 pages. It's a 60-page paper with some really great diagrams in it too.
Yes. I highly suggest people pick it up and read it, mainly just for the diagrams. I mean, they're excellent.
Yeah. And why is this important as horse geeks to even talk about and look through this research paper? And to me, it's because the better we understand how the horse's body actually functions, the better our training is. Because there's a lot of strategies to get horses to do things. But are we causing horses to do things dysfunctionally, creating stress and strain or negative stress and strain? Or are we using training strategies and riding to help our horses move into a coordination that's kind of a higher level of learning than nature provided? And that's exactly what Alexander Technique is for people.
Yeah.
So why don't you kick it off with like just either some general or specific, well, start off general, like what was your impression of this paper and what were some of the things that sort of grabbed your attention right away?
I really like at the beginning when they go through, and I just don't think I've ever really diagnosed it as, like the stance phase or the braking phase, or, I mean, we've touched on that a little bit, but all of those different phases of movement create different responses from the spine. And I found that fascinating. You know, we don't think about it in that way. Or I know he talks about what parts of the spine are more movable than other parts. I mean, do we really think of that? Do we really think about where is the horse the most movable? And what should we do with that? And
exactly.
Then, yeah. And then when they talk about, and I just don't think this is approached, the lateral flexion and rotation. I mean, this is actually the first time I've seen rotation brought into the subject.
That's actually what made this paper quite famous or quite well known. It was the premier research on spinal rotation as a function of the spine and how it's coupled always with lateral bending.
Yes.
And rotation, which is a twisting function of the spine. So in us, if we twist our torso left and right, that's rotation of the spine. If we put that horizontally into a horse's spine, what we feel as riders is a rolling side to side.
Right. I've heard it. Is it the same thing as saying dropping a shoulder, or?
It's definitely related to that.
To that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So it's related to like the horse pushing on the inside leg during a turn, throwing the rib cage in the direction of travel.
Right.
Can be because the rotation of the spine is inverted, meaning it's going the wrong direction to the outside.
Yeah.
So if you think of the spine, well, the ribs are attached to the vertebra of the spine, just like in people. And so in that twisting action, if we twist ourselves left or right, the rib cage moves with it.
Right.
Right. And you can't twist without some degree of lateral bending. Mm-hmm. So if we excessively bend the horse's spine laterally, then we create a rotation issue, right? Either too much or the wrong way. And that's really, this was a breakthrough research paper on rotation, which is the least understood function of the spine, I would say, across the board in the horse industry.
Right.
Very, very few trainers, I think more therapists and vets sort of understand it, but they don't see the causal effect to, say, the dropped shoulder, right, or the asymmetry in leads or directions, or like saddle fitters know it because they chronically flock the saddle maybe higher on one side than the other. That's directly related to a rotation issue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I don't want to get too deep into the lateral bending and rotation part of this paper because I think that's a whole podcast unto itself.
Yes.
But sort of what you mentioned was one of my takeaways that I wanted to start with, is that the spine, I think a lot of riders and trainers imagine the horse's spine sort of like a set of railroad cars. You know what I mean? That there's these intervertebral joints and the vertebra are like the railroad car. And so what we've been told is to be straight on a circle, we sort of imagine like a railroad car coming around a bend, right? The joints in the middle. So I think people think of the spine as equal segments and equal function, like a train.
Wow, it's not.
And it's not at all. and that's what you mentioned, is there's more flexion in certain areas of the spine than others. There's more mobility between certain vertebrae compared to others. There's more lateral bending only in a limited amount of the spine, not the entire spine, right? And so that really struck me too, that I think what we feel as riders is a congruent line of force that can make us think the spine acts like railroad cars, tracking straight or bending on a turn, right? But it doesn't at all. It's much more complex than that.
Yes.
And the other big thing, it's like the more we dive into actual biomechanics, the complexity of it is amazing.
Yes.
And I go to coordinate all of these different functions that they can break down. But like you mentioned, in every stride, there's these changing elements
it was,
throughout the entire body.
And the way they actually, lack of a better term, dissected the information was incredible.
Yes.
I couldn't believe, how could they figure that out? And anyway.
Yeah. And to break it down and really dissect it into stride phases.
Yes.
And then when you get on a horse, you think how fast that goes.
Yeah.
Even at the walk, the strides are happening all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So those changes are happening so fast that the more I studied actual research on mechanics and body functions, I was in awe and realized that it's so ridiculous that we think we can push the rib cage over with our legs, or that we can lift the back with our legs and spurs and reins. And it's like our aids and our maneuvers work so indirectly on this complex coordination of the body. It's very humbling to actually get down into the brass tacks of how things work, because you realize there's no way the rider has control over this.
And what I found also interesting is the same muscle did different things at different gaits.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because that was exactly
really
the segue from the last podcast.
What?
Yeah.
Because when you walk and it doesn't when you trot, and I don't think we think that way.
Well, and that was the last podcast on muscle fiber, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think of all of the epaxial and hypaxial back muscles have the dual function of MFT1 postural type fibers and locomotory type fibers, MFT2s, right? So those back muscles at the deeper core muscles are always having to balance between locomotion and stability.
Yes. It's fascinating.
And it's, I thought the exact same thing when you said that was, there it is in another paper saying it has a dual function of both locomotion and stability. And I think the dual function we also have to think of as equally valuable.
Yes. And that's what creates balance.
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't just do one thing.
Right. So
all the time. So
the postural and stabilizing use of the muscle fibers, it is, how do I want to say this? What it translates into while we're riding is slowing down downward transitions, half halts, full halts, downward transitions, or sort of bringing the horse back within a speed. That's when we're asking the horse to use the stabilizing or postural fibers of the muscle.
Yeah.
Right. And when we ask a horse to go faster or push, we're tapping into the locomotory fibers of the muscle.
Yes.
Right. So faster and faster doesn't equal better. And slower and slower doesn't equal better. And so the thought that the faster we go, the more the belly lifts the back is it can really create some dysfunction in the muscle use and the coordination of the spine.
And actual bony structures like, developing kissing spine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And another thing that fascinated me that really stuck with me was there's several times they mention in there about lowering the neck flexes the back. I mean, I'm putting it very simple, but a couple of times in the paper, they state that lowering the neck flexes the back. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so not what people are hearing.
Right. And while it begins, I think, the process of flexing, what I got from it was Number one, it creates more intervertebral space.
Yes, I think the word he used, and we've used it before, I think we talked about it last week, was more verticality, so that there's opening of space in between.
Opening of space.
Yeah.
Yes. And when we're riding and balancing a horse, because it kind of brings the image that long and low is going to lift the back. No,
right.
Well, it might be the seed of that happening, especially if the horse has had kissing spine or has been working chronically in spinal extension. Then long and low is going to just allow the space to open between the joints of the spine.
Right.
It doesn't lift the back, just like the belly doesn't lift the back. But what we're doing from long and low is beginning to increase spinal flexion.
Right.
Right. So at least we're no longer having a downward force of the spine, which is extension, longitudinal extension of the spine. But we're not lifted enough, not enough flexion to get the weight off the front legs. But I found that interesting too, that the space between the joints actually increases.
Yes.
So I want to kind of go through some of my notes.
Okay.
Because I'm starting at the beginning of the paper, and I don't think we're going to get even. I think I circled the page that I thought we could cover today.
Oh, I wonder
which
if
was
it's
only like 36, right?
Oh, okay. I was wondering. Let me see. What did I get to? What page number? I got to 43.
Oh, okay.
Thinking if we got that far, we would be doing good. But I think you're more spot on because it's a lot.
It's a lot to digest. And so we want to break because it's such an important paper. And I think as riders and horse owners, what's important is that when we learn how things work, there's no getting away from how things are supposed to work in a body. You can't cheat the body.
Right.
You can win a blue ribbon and you can get where you want to go. But ultimately, we pay the price either with behavioral issues because the horse just can't take it, or we cause development of arthritis, strain on tendons and ligaments, front end lameness, hoof changes, bony changes. We can create a lot of problems. And for the amount of money and time that we spend on horses, it's like learning anything that kind of helps preserve the value of our horse should be important to all of us. You know, that's why non-horse people think we're nuts.
That's true.
Because it's a way of life. It's more than just owning a dog or a cat. It kind of becomes a way of life.
I think you're right.
I mean, it even makes you buy a truck instead of a... Everything changes.
Yes.
So one of the things that caught my attention right off the bat on page 1 was, I'm just going to quote it here, objective data on the movements, which is the kinematics, and forces, kinetics, that take place in the horse's back are difficult to obtain, especially in 1999.
Yes.
The mobility of the equine spine is limited, and the thoracolumbar vertebral column is comprised of numerous small joints that are covered with thick muscles. And this is why the research has been so limited. This is why he did this paper, is because there's really limited research on the mechanics of the spine. And I think I was told by one of my mentors, Gavin Schofield, that at one point scientists believed because there was so little movement of each vertebra, particularly through the thoracolumbar spine, thorax and lumbar, that it wasn't important.
Wow.
Yeah, because we're talking 1.5 centimeters. We're talking, I think the maximum degree of movement, which was in the thoracolumbar junction, that was like 13 degrees. And one horse had 20-degree movement.
Right.
What he calls displacement of the vertebra.
Right. What's interesting to me, though, and it just keeps ringing, is that we should be looking at spinal movement because that's where the central nervous system and the spinal cord runs. So
it's obviously a very important part of the body, because without that, horses don't have wheelchairs.
no.
It's like, yeah.
And it's the same for people. You know, if your spine is not functioning optimally, you can have what you would call on a horse personality issues, or fear comes up, or anger comes up, or all those things come up for people too. So
yeah, and as humans know, back pain is debilitating.
yes,
It takes over your life, and it can
yes.
be the same for horses. So up until Jean-Marie Denoix did this research paper, a lot of the studies were in vivo with living subjects. And what they were looking at was sort of the study of muscles and back behavior in living horses, and not the actual mechanics. So he made it a point to go in and really look at the details of how do these bones move? How much space is there? And when he gets into the center of rotation and the instant
I
center of
know.
rotation, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to reread that part. Let's keep it simple to get started.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, and anybody can read this paper. Like, this information is available to all of us. I think I had to pay for this paper, but it was like $25 or something like that.
Okay.
But I think you can find it on PubMed or any of the publishing houses for research papers.
Mm-hmm.
So the next thing I found that I wanted to talk about was between longitudinal extension and flexion, or what they call dorsiventral flexion. Mm-hmm. That's the spine traveling up and down, or the vertebra mm-hmm. moving up and down in the vertical plane. So what I wrote down was the range of motion was about, or sorry, I'm quoting here. The range of motion was about 3 to 4 degrees. Mm-hmm. The maximal range of vertical displacement of the thoracic spine occurred near T15 and was about 1.5 centimeters. So, like you mentioned, it's not equal throughout the spine.
No.
You can
not
have, exactly.
And I think somewhere in there it states when he attaches the rib cage and everything, how, you know, up closer to where we're sitting or above doesn't move hardly at all, dorsal ventrally.
Right.
Which is where us.
I think too, on a practical level, I think that's the importance of the adductor and abductor muscles of the front legs. Mm-hmm. Because I think that sternal lift is coming from the support of the pectoral muscles and the adductor and abductor muscles that surround the front legs.
Yeah.
And that's part of what flexes, because it has to be all the ribs that are attached to the sternum, which is your early thoracic vertebra, upper thoracic vertebra, say T1 through T9 or T11.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's those are muscles that are actually and again, this kind of gets back to the whole theory that the belly lifts the back.
Oh, and don't get me started.
And no, we're going to go over this because it did come up in this paper. And
yeah, it did. Big time. I was all excited.
Sorry, let me get a sip. So, so the muscles that are surrounding what we call the thoracic sling, which would involve the adductor, abductor muscle group, the pectoral muscles, the upper chest muscles that even tie into the shoulders. That's what creates the upward force of the upper thoracic spine. And it doesn't flex all that much. There was very little space. And he talks about the reason being that the tips of the spinous processes, the dorsal part of the bones, mm-hmm. are very long and very close together.
Yes.
So there's not a lot of
There's
physical
not a lot of movement there.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's really the muscles of the upper chest part of, I guess you could say the abdomen, but the upper chest surrounding the sternum that have to push the whole sternum upward.
Yes.
So the sternum is attached to the ribs, which is attached to the upper thoracic spine.
Right.
So I found that fascinating.
I did too.
And like you said, I mean, he looked at maximal thoracolumbar flexion, maximal thoracic flexion, and maximum lumbrosacral flexion, which synchronizes to the maximal protraction of the hind limbs. So we've got the thoracolumbar spine, which is the horse's back, the lumbrosacral spine, which is basically the top of the horse's hindquarter, and engagement of the hindquarter or protraction of the hind limbs. All of that in the bony elements is only changing by 3 or 4 degrees.
Right.
That's amazing.
It makes sense. I mean, for the quadruped to be able to maintain healthy central nervous system, that's important, that it's not that movable.
Absolutely, because it's protecting one of the most important functions of the body, the central nervous system.
Right.
So of course, it's not going to have a lot of movement.
Yep. Put
your microphone up a little. I can't hear you.
Gotcha.
So, and the the maximum vertical displacement was actually at T15, which is just at the back of the saddle. It's really kind of at T15, where would that be? On an English saddle, it would be at the very back of the panels, the back of the saddle. On a saddle, it might even be under the skirt. But it's definitely near the back of the saddle, and that had the most mobility. It could move 1.5 centimeters, which I found interesting because if you imagine a rider that's sitting on their pockets, putting all their body weight in their butt.
Good point.
That's a highly mobile part of the spine. That's also the part of the spine where you see, like a lot of times when I'm looking at horses, somebody will ask me what we call a little roach on the
okay.
Like a little bump.
Yeah.
There's a little bony bump that can form towards the back of the saddle, which is really arthritis.
I was going to say that the body is building up tissue to protect itself from something.
Right, because the challenge in that particular area is you have high mobility of the vertebra, but if the horse's back muscles are not really well developed, you also don't have a lot of protection.
You're right.
For the bone. So the muscles, if they're weak, the soft tissue protection can become quite thin.
Makes sense.
Right? So if the skirt of a Western saddle is constantly rubbing, or if the rider is out of balance, especially too heavy towards the back of the saddle, you're going to keep pushing T15, that area, downward, which is going to eventually, that makes the muscles contract and shorten.
Yep.
Right? Which thins the muscle fibers. It doesn't make them nice and plump and juicy with blood. It actually reduces the blood flow. So the muscle gets thinner, meaning that the bone has to start protecting itself. So what does the bone do to protect itself? It creates more bone.
Yeah.
That's arthritis.
It's a callus. Yeah.
A callus. Which is going to reduce the mobility.
Right.
So
and
it's
maybe increase pain.
It definitely could increase pain, and it's going to reduce mobility in general. So then lifting or flexing the spine can become difficult or uncomfortable for the horse. So, and we see it. You can actually see it and feel it. It's what we call a roach because it looks like a little bump, an elongated sort of oval bump right on the spine, somewhere towards the back of the saddle or just behind the saddle. And it doesn't mean the horse can't function. Just like, I mean, over 30, we all have arthritis, right? Somewhere. I was surprised to find out I was riddled with arthritis in my shoulders when I had an x-ray. But it doesn't deter correct function. It just means we might have to be patient with the process. We definitely can't force it. But the muscles can make up the difference. So it doesn't. Yeah. So the other note I made was, in the last podcast, I titled it, "The Belly Does Not Lift the Back." We talked about that extensively in the last podcast. So in this podcast, I get to say, but the belly does resist the dropping of the back.
Yes. And it's called antagonistic muscles. That's what I loved. He actually said they were antagonistic, which means they are lengthening, not shortening.
Thank you. I had no idea what antagonistic meant.
Yeah, antagonistic, the agonist muscle is the one contracting. Antagonist muscle is the one that needs to lengthen so that biomechanically the other muscle that opposes it can contract.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's agonist, antagonist muscle.
So what it looks like visually is the opposite.
Probably.
Visually.
Our visualization. Yeah.
Yeah. So it looks like when we say the belly lifts the back, we're looking at what appears to be a shortening of the abdominal muscles.
Yeah.
And you're saying technically it's a lengthening.
It's a lengthening. And also what I really thought was important, that it was to support visceral mass acceleration.
Oh, I underlined that part too.
You did?
Yeah. So explain that.
Well, I mean, just pure physics. If you think about managing all the viscera inside the rib cage.
Okay, anatomy teacher, what's viscera?
Viscera is all the contents within what I call the torso, the tube, and it's kept under a compression force so that everything can work. So if you think of the horse at a walk as opposed to trot, how much control do they have to exude to maintain visceral integrity?
Right.
During all of this stuff we're asking them to do.
Right.
So that makes sense to me, because I don't know, a horse's intestinal tract is as long as a football field. That's a lot of crap to manage.
Well, and we even use the term like eviscerate, right? Which means to open up, eviscerate, open up the guts, open up the torso, right? And so the viscera is basically what keeps the integrity of the guts and the vital organs.
Yeah.
Normalizes, it was explained to me as normalizing the cabin pressure, so to speak.
Right. And I don't think people realize that, and this is a whole nother podcast about fascia, but fascia plays a key importance in maintaining compartmental pressure.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the same in protecting tendons and ligaments. Yes. So, yeah. And so that's at the, well, I'll read what I underlined. The activity of the rectus abdominis muscles during the last part of the swing phase and the first part of the stance phase of each diagonal at the trot limits passive vertebral column extension and supports visceral mass acceleration.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's what that means. So the belly doesn't lift the back, but the engagement of the abdominal muscles supports, it resists extension of the spine or the downward force of the back.
Right.
And then what I found fascinating were where they put electrodes on the horse and measured, it's a diagram, which I can't show on a podcast, but when they put electrodes on the muscles and measured muscle activity, every time the longissimus muscle was most active, the rectus abdominis and the oblique internus abdominis, so all the belly muscles,
all the ab muscles,
were inactive. And
well,
then
and that's
when the back muscle was,
yeah.
And so that's exactly what you're talking about, that there's a fluctuation of activity when the back muscle is flexing the spine upward, and then it needs to relax. The belly muscles are preventing the spine from going downward. That's what keeps the back lifted during forward motion.
Yes.
So it gets into, you can really see again why this myth of the belly lifting the back is so perpetuated.
Yes.
Because there's a little bit of truth in every myth. Do you know what I mean?
I like that.
It's more often that it's simplified too much. And so in simplification, it becomes incorrect or inaccurate.
Inaccurate, yep.
It's more complex than just the belly lifts the back. The belly does support, but it supports in alternations with the work of the back muscle.
Yes, depending upon the gait and the stance, what phase you're going through with the kinematics of the legs.
I know. And so talk about that a little bit. What are the kinematics? What are kinematics? And what are the kinematics of the leg movement?
Well, I looked it up under several different sites. And what I found very interesting is everybody's language around it is different.
Kinematics to me, what he even says in the beginning of the paper just means movement.
Movement.
It just means movement. And the best description I ever heard of kinematics was the geometric pattern of the movement. Yeah. So if we could look at the movement, because kinematics involves movement, there's a flight path.
Yes.
So if we could put little dots during the movement, we would discover the geometric form of the flight path.
Right.
And that's what kinematics to me means. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, it was just, it's so interesting that, like I said, there's not one language around it. Some people are calling them stance phases. Some people are calling them braking and pushing. There's no, it's kind of like in anatomy, there's one language. And they set it up that way. So anatomically, you know, a person standing with their palms forward, that's anatomical position. Otherwise, cranial, caudal, front and back gets all messed up. So
absolutely. And I think that's true with horses, but I think that there is an overlap of terminology that can make it confusing. Because I really liked the way he described the kinematics in this paper was the protraction, and what was the opposite? Retraction.
Yeah.
Of the leg movement.
And it makes sense because I've worked in Alexander community, there are researchers, and to write a paper and have it published, there's a certain language you have to use.
Well, that's the
common.
Well, same with veterinary medicine. It is very specific and very common. So with a quadruped, we have cranial caudal, which is head is cranium, caudal is tail, to describe the directions front to back.
Right.
So what is that called in the human?
Front to back. Front. Well, we go cranial caudal. We do use that.
Okay. But we think in terms of...
it's going to be in a vertical plane, not a horizontal plane.
Right. And then there's the directions of dorsal ventral. So on a horse, dorsal is the top, ventral is the bottom.
Right.
And is that the same in humans?
Pretty much.
Okay. So we might be on track.
Yeah, you just have to stand it up when you go to the human.
Yes, it's just vertical oriented instead of horizontally oriented. So that was the other thing. Oh, and this ties into the last paper really directly. The longissimus dorsi muscle, which is the longest of all the back muscles.
Right.
Acts both to contribute to propulsion and to stabilize the vertebral column.
Yes.
That's exactly what we talked about in the last paper where they looked at muscle fiber types.
Yes.
So it's nice to get that confirmation. Anything you wanted to add? Because I talked about the opposition of force. So when they put sensors on the back muscles and the belly muscles, what you see is a force opposition.
Right.
So again, that can make it look like the belly's lifting the back, but it's working in conjunction with the back muscles. The back muscle lifts in activity and then relaxes, and then the belly muscle lengthens in activity to prevent the downward force of the spine.
Yeah.
Would you say that's more accurate in how?
And that's, if you think about it, it's how a system works. You can't simultaneously contract your bicep in the front and the muscles in the back of your arm. Something would tear.
Oh,
the body can't contract both. It's kind of like watching a football game or soccer, and you see this guy running and he all of a sudden grabs his hamstring, and you can go, oh, geez, he tore his hamstring. Well, the reason that happened was the quad in the front of the leg didn't let go.
Oh,
for the hamstring. Yeah, it stayed contracted, and then the hamstring went to contract, and that's the weaker muscle. It's going to tear. So it's just the law of opposites on how the body works.
And that is actually what we feel as riders. When you look at the anatomy and the mechanics of the anatomy. Oh, and we didn't finish talking about strides. Sorry, we got derailed there. But it's like, it's so complex and it's happening so fast. Mm-hmm. What we can only be conscious of in real time when we're riding are the forces.
Exactly.
Of the forces. So that dynamic between the up and down, between the belly and the back muscles happens so fast. All we feel is a consistent lifted force.
Yes.
Right. But what's actually happening is a lot more complex. And that's what you mentioned is in this paper, he really broke it down to different phases of the stride. So whether you call it the braking phase or the protraction of the limb, when any of the four legs are in a forward placement with the hoof just landing on the ground, that's one phase of movement.
Right.
So that's what he's calling the protraction of the limb. It could be called the braking phase of the stride. Any other names you came across? Or what's it called in a human?
I don't know. I haven't done the research into in that kind of human movement. A lot of people, we're just using the word stance phase.
So stance to me is the transitional phase of the stride between, like, the leg swings through the air, the hoof hits the ground, you begin protraction. Well, protraction is the swing forward. The braking phase of the stride begins when the hoof hits the ground. And then in that phase of the stride, it's the postural or resistant phase of the stride, where the body is stabilizing. Then it goes through stance, which ideally should be vertical under the torso. Ideally. So the stance phase is the brief moment between sort of the deceleration or the stabilization of the body with the leg forward. Then the leg is vertical and then transitions. So the vertical stance phase is the transition between braking and pushing.
Yes.
Or resisting and going forward, or between stabilization and locomotion. You could say all of those things.
Yes.
So then in the pushing phase is where the hoof begins leaving the ground again.
Right.
Right? Or protracting, contracting, I think is the opposite.
Retracting?
Retracting. Thank you. Yes. Too many terms in my head. They're all getting muddled. So as the leg, as the hoof leaves the ground, the leg is in a backwards relationship to the torso. And that's where locomotion happens. Then the leg swings forward again or protracts. The hoof hits the ground, and that's the resistant phase of the stride. And if you think in real time of how fast this is happening, even at the walk.
I try to figure out where the placement is of the hind legs at the walk, and I can't figure it out.
Not only that, but they're alternating left and right. And like, you got 4 legs. So it's like, that's a lot.
It's too much noise.
Yeah. And so, and that's the other thing, even with humans, when one leg is in motion, as one of our legs is creating stability and resisting forward motion, which is the braking phase when our foot lands in front of our body, the other leg is simultaneously creating locomotion.
Yes.
By being behind the body. So humans go through the same 3 phases of every stride, and let's just simplify it and call it the braking or resistance phase, the stance phase, and then the locomotion phase.
Yeah, let's keep it simple.
Yeah. So, and I think that was important to cover, because if you think of everything we talked about with muscle fiber types, you think of 4 legs, you know, working at different times in different phases of the stance, all in very quick motion, faster than the human eye can detect. I mean, we have to really slow it down. Even at the walk, we can't see all 3 phases of every stride.
Yes.
It happens too fast. And at the trot and canter, forget about it. So we have to break it down into slow motion just to see the phases of the stride. And all of that happening at the same time, you just go, there's no way we're going to control that.
No.
By trying to get the hind legs deeper under the body with a whip or a bamboo stick. You know, it's like, no. And if humans start to monkey around with mechanics, that's like me working on my car. It's not going to go well. It's just not going to go well. That's why I pay a mechanic. I'm going to have a whole bucket full of spare parts when I put the
when you try to get it back together.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how we can create dysfunction in the horse, when we think it's as simple.
It's as simple
as placing the leg deeper under the body by stimulating something that creates a reflex. It's much more complex than that.
Yes.
And so if we just try to restrict the leverage and push the hind legs deeper underneath, we usually screw up the mechanics pretty bad.
Yes.
I think too, the other thing to recognize is in a lot of sports, the underlying thought is faster equals better, because faster creates more engagement. Faster is how the horse lifts the back. But with what we just talked about, if we want more engagement, then we want more protraction of the hind limbs. We want the hind legs to come and land closer to the center of the body. Well, that's in the stabilization phase of the stride, not the locomotion phase of the stride.
And it's interesting to me. I haven't been in the breeding world in a while. When I took my horses to inspection, Hanoverian and Oldenburg, and this was 20 years ago. That's what they wanted to see.
What?
They wanted to see the horse trotting as fast as it could, because they considered that engagement.
Yeah, and technically, well, we'll have to do a different podcast. I think we did engagement and disengagement.
Yes.
So that really is part of the spinal functions And it is related more to the pelvis. So the movement of the pelvis is where it's going to influence the placement of the legs. So the spine influences the movement of the pelvis. The movement of the pelvis determines the placement of the legs. So engaged means we have a deeper placement of the hind legs, which means the pelvis is rotating more around the hip joint, which works in conjunction with the flexion of the spine. So if we want more engagement and more of a lifted back, that's related to postural stability.
Yes.
It's related to braking, which is slowing down, not speeding up.
Yep.
And it's related to resistance rather than locomotion.
All the opposites.
All the opposites, right? And when the leg is in the pushing phase, the pelvis is also rotated more backwards. And that's the moment that the belly is supporting
it has to, because that's a huge force that's kind of dumping down into the viscera.
Right. So instead of the spine dropping down into extension, that's the moment that the belly muscles are most active. And now actually it makes sense to me that they're working in length because the pelvis is rotated backwards. So the whole abdominal wall is lengthening and contracting in order to prevent the downward force of the spine. Right. And so we do see the belly work more when the hind leg is behind the torso, pushing backwards in a locomotion phase.
Yes.
So if locomotion exceeds stabilizing, then the pelvis is going to be permanently more backwards than it can come forward, which means we disengage the hindquarter.
Exactly. That's hind end disengagement.
So it does not lead to more engagement, it leads to more disengagement.
Yes.
Which over time, the belly muscles just can't work that hard.
No.
And the back is going to start going into extension.
Exactly. Yeah. The lowered top line.
Yeah. So I just found that this conversation goes much deeper into the role of the abdominal muscles. And again, we can see where some of the errors visually lead us down the path of poor mechanics that we create through how we train.
Yes.
And how we ride.
Yes.
So understanding the complexity of it, I think, is important even as horse owners, so that we're really not doing damage.
Yes.
To our horses, right? And having to pay more vet bills and having a horse that has 6 weeks off, right? Or can't show anymore because the damage is too severe.
Or injections.
Or inject all the expensive stuff. And boy, when you get into upper leg and back diagnostics, cha-ching, cha-ching. Now we're talking it's scintigraphy and it just gets really expensive because now they can do horsey MRIs, but it's going to cost you a boatload.
Yep.
Yeah. And that, I think, one of the biggest problems, and this was actually how I met Jean-Luc, was kissing spine, which is sort of the layman's terms, has become a real issue for horses across the board of different sports. And what kissing spine is the dorsal spinous processes are coming too close together, right? So it becomes a bone-on-bone issue. And what I was told, I had a horse who actually had congenital kissing spine. Usually it's a functional problem,
right,
from how we ride, but it can be congenital. He had very weak ligaments. And so the ligament system that supports the spine obviously was weak as well, because he developed severe kissing spine through the whole upper thoracic area, with the worst of it being about T13, which was right underneath where you sit. So I discovered that by being launched 20 feet off the horse after a bucking frenzy.
Oops.
Because I didn't know it was there. Yeah, that's what kissing spine does.
Yeah.
Incredible, painful spinal back issue.
It'd be much easier if they could just tell us.
Yeah, but it's one where you're going to get hurt. It's not a training issue. And so I was told at the time by veterinarians that the remedy for that is a surgery where they go in and shave off part of the dorsal bone so that it creates more space.
Wow.
And I went, okay, that sounds serious and expensive. And even if I could afford it, I don't know that I would want my horse to have back surgery.
Right.
And he was only 6 years old, 6, 7, or 8, somewhere in there when I figured out what his problem was. And the x-rays were atrocious. So the remedy for that, which kind of leads us into the next part of the paper that you had mentioned too, that lengthening the neck, which we talked about in the beginning, is going to create more intervertebral space.
Yes.
Right? Hence, the remedy for kissing spine is long and low.
For a while.
For a while. Right?
Maybe not forever, but for a while.
Or increasing flexion of the spine, which is the opposite direction. So kissing spine, like flexion and extension, which is the vertical, what we're referring to as longitudinal flexion, longitudinal extension of the spine, which is in the vertical direction. So extension and flexion are just generic terms for every single joint in the body. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, extension means the bones of the joint are coming closer together.
It's a simple way.
Okay. And flexion means the bones of the joint are moving farther apart. So when we look at the horse's spine as a series of joints, the bottom side or ventral, the belly side, is the point of reference when we're talking about flexion and extension of the spine. So in other words, when the bones of the vertebra come closer together at the bottom of the spine, on the belly side of the spine, we call that longitudinal flexion. So kissing spine is just either perpetuated, could be genetic, I found out, but usually it's functional. When we ride the horse with a dropped back, what's happening is the bottom part of the spinal bones are coming apart, farther apart, which means the dorsal tips or the spinous processes are reducing space and coming closer together. Right? And so the way we can think about it in any joint is if we just take our index finger and you move the fingernail to the right, the knuckle at the bottom of the finger is going to go left.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
That's how the body works.
Yeah.
Right. And it's that
it's
opposition.
Like the law, it's the oppositional, it's the law of opposites.
Right.
How it works.
So if the bones on the underside of the spine are getting farther apart, then those long dorsal bones at the top of the spine are coming closer together. That is the condition that's known as kissing spine.
Yes.
Because they actually start to touch bone on bone, which will get you seriously bucked off. And you know,
I always behavior issues.
Well, I always know the difference between behavior and pain by the level of intensity the horse has.
Ah, good point.
I go behavior, they'll give it a try, but if it's pain, there's no way you're staying on that.
Yeah, I know.
Or if you do stay on, you're lucky, but you need to call the vet. Because it's going to be serious and it's going to be, it's not something you can train out of the horse because it's pain-based.
Right.
So then it makes sense that long and low or lengthening the neck is going to put the spine in the opposite use.
Right.
You're not going to increase flexion enough to lift the back. There's still going to be too much weight on the front limbs, which can create other problems. But at least, and he confirms in this paper, it does create more space between the vertebra.
Yes.
So you're no longer actively in longitudinal extension. You're creating space between the vertebra, but it's not enough to get the weight off the front legs.
Right.
So it's the instinctual posture of grazing and sleeping and resting.
Yeah, and there was another study. A client brought it to my attention because there's a lot of head shaking going on and things like that. And in this other veterinarian clarified, I'll have to find out who he is, that the head shaking was eliminated when the horse lowered its head.
Ah.
And I thought that was fascinating. I said, well, that's simple.
That actually makes sense to me, because when the back is pushing down in extension, the head and neck go up. So
exactly.
the cervical spine in extension causes the head and neck to elevate. So the base of the neck, having more space between each vertebra, tilts the head backwards and elevates the neck.
Yeah.
And the side effect, every single time the back is pushing down, there's the relationship of hyperrotation.
Yes.
Which we will get into in the next podcast. But hyperrotation is a rapid side-to-side twisting that's happening so fast it creates instability. So head shaking side to side would make sense that it's the side effect of extension. It's always coupled with hyperrotation. Yeah. Or hyper twisting, very fast twisting, back and forth. So hence the head shaking. So the first remedy of that, just like kissing spine, lengthen the neck. Mm-hmm. Because that's also going to reduce the hyperrotation, the hypermobility side to side. And when we ride, if we want to get a horse, what we actually feel more than the downward force of the back is the side effect of the rapid side to side movement. That's much more obvious to us as riders. And we can actually resist the side to side movement as a way to discourage the back pushing down. Yep. And to get to long and low. And we just stabilize that midline and resist the side to side forces, and they lower the neck. Yep. Or we could teach them to lower the neck. It'll still have some benefit. Yes. But I think we're out of time for this podcast. So we better wrap it up. Good, and I think we may have 2 or 3 podcasts on this. I'm not sure. And just so you guys know, they may or may not be in order, because I do have a guest speaker coming, Sam, to talk more about heart math and Chinese medicine or acupressure. So thank you guys for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our discussion of this really important paper. I will put this in the description box below and in the show notes, the title of the paper and the author. So if you want to find it for yourself, you can. And again, going to remind you, please like, please share, please subscribe, and please comment. We love the comments. And we really thank you for joining us. I think the next segment for me to talk about with this same paper is what we just started, how the different uses of the neck or the cervical spine can influence the thoracolumbar. I think
that's a good one.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that'll be a good one to pick up with next time. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.